Just check the time. Try not to go on too long. Now, for those of you who have attended some of my lectures before, you probably will realise that I always attempt to address too much during my lectures. So if you see any of you falling asleep, I speed things up and try and make the thing as concise and short as myself. Really. So the Labour Must Wait, the Irish Labour Movement and the Decade of Revolution, and the premise of this talk is actually, well, the first thing we should say is that Labour Must Wait is a catchphrase that has been wrongly attributed to David Ura. It was actually created by Joe Devlin in an attack on David Ura for the nature of David Ura's attitude towards Labour at the sort of re-foundation of Sinn Féin in October 1917, the second Sinn Féin party. Now, it's as Joe Devlin was quite good at coming up with catchphrases and catchy things for public oratory, and it more or less sums up what David Ura's argument was. David Ura sort of oscillated in his attitude towards Labour and Labour's demands, depending on what his political objectives were at the time. He was a fine opportunist. So in this period, he was supportive of Labour to an extent, but he thought that the national struggle, or the struggle for the Republic, would take precedent over Labour. He didn't say Labour should wait. Okay, we'll clear that up. But what this talk really is about is the way that, as Walter Benjamin, the famous philosopher, says, that history really is written from the perspective of the winners. It's the triumphant procession of the victor over the prostate. I'm not talking about someone walking on their backside, I'm talking about the people who lost. History is written by the winners. And in this period, the winners, on both sides of the border, were essentially the most conservative and the wealthiest elements in Irish society. The losers were the poorest elements of Irish society. So the outcome, okay, would suggest that there was nothing really socially revolutionary happening in Ireland in this period. But that there's the story that the victors want us to understand. In fact, Ireland, between 1917 and 1923, in various areas, at various times, witnessed a social revolutionary tumult, where at particular times, considerable amounts of the local population seized control of the means of production in factories, set up Soviets. There were strikes of tens of thousands of people in the major industrial centres. And all the attributes, or all the ingredients for a social revolution, were present in different areas of the country at different times in this period. That a social revolution didn't emerge owes as much to the forces opposed to the poorest and the most disadvantaged elements in Irish society than it does to any unwillingness on their part not to engage in social revolution. The expectation of ordinary people to engage in trade unionism, and particularly in industrial unionism and trade union militancy during this period, the expectation of the ordinary people about what the Irish Revolution represented and what they wanted to derive out of it was very different and far more radical than what actually comes out of the revolutionary period. So we're going to address 9, as I say, I'm a little bit ambitious in my scope, 9 themes in terms of this period, to try and give you some flavour of the period as a whole, and to try and prove the thesis that in fact there was a considerable amount of activism and there was a considerable amount of demand for a new social and political dispensation which reflected the rights of ordinary people. That there were a considerable amount of people in Ireland during the revolutionary period who wanted to create a socialist Ireland. Okay? So we're going to look at it very briefly in terms of the different historical positions on this question. The typical position, we call it the liberal revisionist position, and then my position, which comes from the School of History from below, or a Marxist analysis of Irish history. We're going to look at it in terms of the background of the period and the rise of a very specific type of trade unionism in Ireland called Syndicalism. I'm going to explain that very, very briefly. Syndicalism is identified with the two dominant personalities of the labour movement in the early 20th century in Ireland, James Larkin and James Connolly. We will then look at the rise in trade union militancy, and we'll chronologically go through the period as a whole, both north and south. We look at the rise of trade union militancy in respect to the wartime boom and demands of ordinary people for better wages and conditions. We will then look at Labour's attitude towards the issues of conscription during the conscription crisis, and the Labour Party's decision not to stand in the 1918 general election and the implications that this had for the position of Labour and socialism across Ireland, and more particularly in Belfast. We will then look at the Labour Party central role in the creation of the democratic programme, which was adopted at the opening of the first Dáil in January 1919. And then we will look in some detail at the rise of trade union militancy in Belfast and the famous engineers strike in 1918, the implications which this had in terms of local politics in Belfast in 1920, and then we're going to look at the Northern Counter-Revolution, how this trade union militancy was broken up and how a counter-revolutionary dispensation was established in the North. We will then look at the rise of trade union militancy in the South, because there's a bit of a time lag, that militancy in the South, particularly amongst agricultural labourers, happens after the rise of militancy in the North. And we look at the rise of the Southern Soviets, and we will then look at the nature of the counter-revolution in the 26 counties, how these attempts by ordinary people in the 26 counties to change society were suppressed in the 26 counties. The best way that I can try and give you some flavour of this is not to address everything that happened in every single county. So, standing here tonight in Derry, I would tell you that I would select the best county in Ireland, Tyrone. And I will look at the specific case studies and the specific examples that I have studied in my own research and my own work, to try and give you some sort of indication about the nature of this trade union militancy across the period, and I give you little small case studies from Tyrone to try and give you some sort of idea about what this entailed and what it meant. Okay? So, historical positions. The classical historical position, or what could be called the Irish revisionist position on this period, is best summed up in Peter Hart's. Now, this is not from Peter Hart's seminal book, The IRA and Its Enemies. It's from his other book, The IRA at War. But Hart says, he poses a rhetorical question, which he answers in many terms before he even sets it. Can we classify it, the Irish Revolution, as a social revolution, either realised or attempted? Right? And he says, on both counts, the answer is no. There was no socially revolutionary situation in Ireland, even in prospect. Okay? Now, in a typically sort of revisionist way, he then sets up a criteria for social revolution that no situation in human history would ever meet. He counts all the ways that Ireland was quite similar to a social revolution before eventually saying, because it doesn't fulfil some aspects of this criteria, it can therefore not fulfil the description. As you may have guessed, I come from a different perspective, and my perspective reflects that of Fergus Campbell in his excellent book Land Revolution in the West of Ireland, who writes from the perspective of the School of History from Below. And Campbell says the revolution in Ireland resulted in the creation of a conservative state, both north and south. But not all Irish revolutionaries were conservative, and that there were radical impulses which demonstrate that the revolution was neither innately or inevitably conservative. Okay? So, in one analysis is sort of like, there's nothing to see here. No, there was no attempts to change the nature of Irish society. There was no attempts to create a social revolution in Ireland. In fact, the revisionist perspective tends to view the revolutionary period as a blip in the nice procession of liberal modernity and progress towards where we are today, which is fine, thank you very much, and we shouldn't change it either. Okay? The perspective of history from below looks at the nature of society, the condition of ordinary people in society, and the demands on what ordinary people do to try and change their circumstances. Right? And it comes typically from the work of an English Marxist historian called E.P. Thompson, who characterised history differently. He says that because of this revisionism, he says, but so great has been the reaction in our time against Whig or Marxist interpretations of history that some scholars have propagated a ridiculous reversal of historical roles. The persecuted are seen as forerunners of oppression, and the oppressors as victims of persecution. Okay? All those poor creators up in their mansions with their big businesses, you know, in fear of their lives, while these degenerate working class people are trying to steal all their wealth. Both Hobsbawm and Thompson reflect then on what is the real nature of history. And history is, as Marx says at the beginning of the 1848 Communist Manifesto, the history of human society up until this point is the history of class conflicts.
And he characterises ordinary people's history as the history of the, people organising themselves in defence of authority and the movements of social protest in which the underlying conflict of poor against rich is clearly visible. The brilliant thing about the revolutionary period in Ireland is that in a revolutionary period, ordinary people feel empowered and they think they have the opportunity to change the social system which they previously felt powerless against. Okay? That it's in this period of revolutionary change that working class people in Ireland suggest to themselves, organise themselves and try to enact a better society from their perspective. That they met forces which perhaps thought that their idea of a better society was not a good society at all, is why this ended in what was quite a conservative revolution. As Kevin O'Higgins, the poster boy of the New Free State, said, we were the most conservative revolutionaries ever to implement a successful revolution. He's talking about the Common and Yale Free State government. Okay? The reason why there was a partial independence in 26 counties, the reason why some sort of political progress was made was because the entire society, particularly the entire national society in Ireland, essentially rose up during the revolution. And that most of the ordinary people who engaged in this revolution had social aspirations far in excess of what Kevin O'Higgins and the people who go on to form the Free State would have been satisfied. Kevin O'Higgins describes the democratic programme of the First Dáil, even though he's a member of the First Dáil, as a fairy story, as something that can never be changed. He very much subscribes to the modern motto of Tina, there is no alternative. Okay? Now, Howard Zinn, who wrote writes history from the American perspective, says that change happens, and this is what ordinary people were doing in Ireland in this period. Change happens, we don't have to engage in grand heroic actions to participate in the process of change. Small acts, when multiplied by millions of people, can transform the world. And if we look across the period in Ireland from 1917 up until 1923, and I deliberately avoided mentioning 1916 because I mentioned it later on, but this is the period of trade union militancy and demands for real change. Okay? Now, my hypothesis is that ordinary people knew that they were at the wrong end of society, but that for most of the period they had no opportunity to challenge the status quo. That there was a tradition, and we're going to talk about Tyrone for a moment, there was a tradition in Ireland of people being very conscious of the fact that a better society was possible, but feeling powerless to achieve it. This is why 9 million people leave Ireland in the 19th century and 2 million people leave Ireland in the 20th century. It's the people at the bottom of the social rung of the ladder who are essentially forced to leave the country because of the forces of economic and social circumstance. Right? The idea that these people understood this all the time and resented it all the time, I think, can be proved quite well. Now, the history of labour organisation in Ireland dates back to the Belfast Trades Council and the Dublin Trades Council of 1886. And this is the first real period of trade union mobilisation in Ireland, on what was called the New Unionism, which essentially spreads from Britain. This is important because in the area that we're going to be talking about, Tyrone, there was a degree of New Unionism. And it was New Unionism that was centred on the people at the very base of society, agricultural labourers and labourers in towns. And they organised themselves in trade unions. A lot of them were also members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood. This leads to the creation of the Irish Trade Union Congress in 1884, and then to an Irish branch 2 years previously of the Independent Labour Party. The ramifications for this, from the area that we're going to be studying, will go to the creation of the Ulster Labourers Union. Well, the Ulster Labourers Union was the initiative of Richard McGee, who will later be he's a Protestant Home Ruler and a member of the National Dock Workers Union. He will later be a Redmondite MP for Mid-Tyrone. In the late 1880s and early 1890s, he's far more radical in his politics. Now, the Ulster Labourers Union finds a very, very strong reception in East Tyrone, which is where we're going to be talking about. And I think the best way to try and give you some flavour of this is to talk about a meeting that was held in the Foster's Hall in Dungannon in 1894. Alright? It was a venue for the formation of the Ulster Labourers Union in the town. Local Scotchman and Presbyterian Poor Lord Guardian, John D. Crockett, told the audience that, let the wage be what it may, human beings ought to give the least possible amount of time compatible with supplying the necessities of life to industrial or manual labour. He continued, a poor man's labour is the only capital he has, and he ought to sell it in the market to the highest bidder. In a passage relevant to present day representations of the working class, Crockett then stated that the great majority of these, or those who are poor, are affected with poverty, are poor not by their own fault, but by their own choice, but because of the conditions imposed by society at large. Poverty is not an individual or personal crime, but a social crime. He then encouraged his audience to devise some means of regulating your supply of labour to the demands made for it in Dungannon. Crockett went on to pinpoint local sectarianism as an obstacle to progress. He said, but it is sad and remarkable fact that no matter what the movement is, some men, for sinister motives doubtless, always give it a religious or political colour. I desire to say that this is a movement devoid of all religious, political or party bias. It is a movement for the improvement of labouring men, be they Protestant, Catholic or pagan. The first duty of a church is to minister to the poor, but so far as we can gather from the demeanour of most churchgoers and office bearers in Dungannon, the first duty, according to their view, is to the rich. Okay? Now this speaks with a very firm reception amongst working class people here and amongst in East Rome and amongst agricultural labourers. And by 1889 there's a strike in the Congo collieries. This is the Congo, actually maybe on our colliery. These are members of the Congo colliery, and it's members of the Irish Republican Brotherhood and Fosters and the Ulster Labourers Union who engaged in strike action in order to improve their conditions after 3 of their fellow members were killed in an accident in the strike. Okay? The employer employs scab labour and the strikers attack the blacklegs. And one of the strikers, I might tell you a small personal anecdote, was a man called George McMahon, who happened to be my great-grandfather. And I remember well the day I took his, around the courts, name and shame, well, from 1898, and I showed it to his daughter, my granny, and said, what do you think of your lad now? I didn't know that he got 6 months hard labour for beating up a strikebreaker. But what the central point here is that there was a recognition amongst ordinary people that society, they needed society to change for the very basic fact that they would be allowed to stay in their own country. That the social system here in Ireland meant that Tyrone was one of the top 10 counties in the country for emigration. Okay? There was a large labouring population. There was a labourer for every farmer in Tyrone. Okay? And the vast majority of farmers who had purchased land under the Wyndham Act and before that the earlier Land Acts were small farmers and what you would call a small farmer labourer hybrid. They spent half of the year working for other farmers, selling their labour, and the rest of the time tending farms. The majority of people living in Tyrone either worked in considerable manufacturing in the Cookstown and Dungannon Poor Law unions for very little pay, or they eked out a very, very miserable existence indeed. If you read something like the McRae report of the 1890s on the conditions of agricultural labourers, they eked a very, very mean existence out as agricultural labourers. Okay? So these people understood what poverty was. These are the people that someone like Frantz Fanon, writing about Africa, would call the wretched of the earth. Now, the nature of the economy and the nature and the undeveloped nature of trade unionism in Ireland, particularly the fact that the working class was so poorly organised and so geographically dispersed, meant that new unionism, or what's called craft unionism after this, didn't make much of an impact in Ireland. It didn't have large centres of industrial workforce like the British unions. Okay? In fact, it had an awful lot of people on a subsistence level living very much hand to mouth. Okay? The type of trade unionism that was particularly suited to organising people like this, who under normal conditions of trade unionism would be very difficult to organise, was introduced to Ireland by this man, James Larkin. Okay? And it was syndicalism. Rather than a range of different craft-based unions, a union for carpenters, a union for tailors, a union for engineers, syndicalism promotes the idea of one big union. Okay? If you organise all workers in one union, and an injury to one, okay, is a concern to all. and you employ the tactic of the sympathetic strike in order to force employers to grant better conditions, and this is a process by which eventually you will seize control of society. And the new socialist society will actually grow up within the existing system. This finds its firmest expression in the industrial workers of the world, or the Wobblies in America. And the other great syndicalist of the early 20th century, James Connolly, spends a lot of time organising for the IWW in America before he returns to Ireland. Okay, this is a picture of Larkin's first foray into Irish trade unionism, the 1907 Belfast charter strike. Okay, he comes to Ireland as a member of a British union, and then because of the lack of support from Thomas Saxon, the leader of the union, he then decides that Ireland needs its own, he needs to decolonise its trade union movement and needs to set up one big union. As a result of this, Larkin establishes the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Okay, so the Irish Transport and General Workers Union are set up as a result of the charter strike in Belfast. Okay, this then leads to the creation of the Socialist Party of Ireland, the Independent Labour Party, which is partially affiliated to its contemporary in Britain. Okay, the Labour Representation Committee, which had previously been founded, but more importantly then, and more on the initiative of James Connolly and Larkin, we get the amalgamation of the Irish Trade Union Congress and the new Irish Labour Party in the Irish Trade Union Congress and Labour Party. Okay? And the one big union linked to this, although other unions affiliate with this organisation, is the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. Okay? The Irish Transport and General Workers Union at the height of this period is almost 150,000 members. Trade union membership grows from about 100,000 in 1916 up to 250,000 by the height of the revolutionary period. You also then have the creation of the Irish Citizen Army, and this is the Irish Citizen Army outside Liberty Hall, the headquarters of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, the start of the First World War, and their banner, you serve neither king nor Kaiser. Now, so, Larkin is born in Liverpool to parents from County Armagh, we think from Mullabon. Okay? He's the organiser of the dock workers and the charters in Liverpool. He comes to Belfast for the British Labour Conference, okay, and he stays to organise dock workers in the area. He then becomes a reluctant leader of the Belfast Dockers and Charters strike in 1907, right, which is a cross-denominational strike, which involves Catholics and Protestants, and actually involves the police going out to strike, and is directed at the famous Gallagher tobacco works in particular. Okay, now this strike actually ends in defeat, but it changes Larkin's attitude towards trade unionism. It sets Larkin on a course towards the organisation of an indigenous one big union, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union, and the use of syndicalism and the sympathetic strike as a tool to challenge employers in Ireland. So this is Larkin and the Belfast Strike Committee in 1907. Now, although they didn't actually get on that well personally, the second really significant figure in the development of syndicalism in Ireland is James Connolly. James Connolly is born in Edinburgh to parents from Scotch Town in County Monaghan. We see a pattern here of the sons of the rural poor who are forced to leave South Armagh and Monaghan and cross much of Ulster and go to Glasgow and Edinburgh and Liverpool, and they carry their dissatisfaction with them, and they maintain a certain amount of affinity for Ireland. Okay? He got his socialism from Marx and his nationalism from his Fenian uncle. He was invited to Dublin in 1886 to organise the socialist movement. He forms the Irish Republican Socialist Party, the Irish Socialist Republican Party, the Irish Republican Socialist Party, something else entirely. It's a bit like the People's Front of Judea and at the end of the life of Fran. So immigrated to the US for economic reasons in 1903, and he returns home and he's sent to Belfast to organise for the Irish Transport and General Workers Union between 1910 and 1914, and it's in this period that he faces an awful lot of opposition in Belfast from the leaders of the amalgamated trade unions. These are specific craft trade unions, particularly one called New Galway, and he has a massive controversy with the leader of Belfast unionism, or trade unionism, William Walker. Okay? Connolly wins these arguments with the leadership of trade unionism, but not so much with working class, particularly common people in Belfast. And this has a massive impact on the leadership of Labour during the revolutionary period. So what does Connolly promote? Connolly is as vociferous in his attacks of orange employers and nationalist employers. He identifies a social system where he doesn't differentiate in terms of religious affiliation or nationalism or unionism. And this is before he goes to America, but we look at a couple of very quick quotes when he's writing in residency in Belfast. He said, "It may be pleaded that the ideal of a socialist republic, implying as it does a complete political and economic revolution, would be sure to alienate all our middle class and aristocratic supporters who would dread the loss of their property and privileges." And this is a serious consideration during the Sinn Féin revolution. Okay, Sinn Féin is essentially a lower middle class organisation with a lower class and working class support base. And they're very, very conscious of their cross-class character and their attempts not to alienate indigenous Irish capitalism. So they don't raise class issues. And Connolly's analysis from the time he comes to Ireland is that this is no way to proceed. He says that what does this objection mean? That we must conciliate the privileged classes in Ireland, but you can only disarm their hostility by assuring them not being interfered with. That is to say, you must guarantee that when Ireland is free of foreign domination, the green-coated Irish soldiers will guard the fraudulent gains of capitalist and landlord from the thin hands of the poor, just as remorselessly and just as effectually as the scarlet-coated emissaries of England do today. On no other basis will the classes unite with you. Do you expect the masses to fight for this ideal? And this is one of the major problems or the major weaknesses in attracting support from working class Protestants at Ulster. Not so much the skilled members of the amalgamated trade unions, who were very firmly unionist and loyalist, but the unorganised Protestant working class in places like Belfast were amenable to a socialist message, but Green Toryism was not attracted to them at all. Better the devil they knew than the one they didn't know. Okay? And this is Connolly's analysis from the very beginning. Connolly says, thus Labour is ever encouraged to revolt against the orange sweaters of the north, but nothing must be done to encourage any such revolt against the nationalist sweaters of the south. The revolt of Labour, when it can be manipulated as an asset of the Home Rule movement, is all right, but the revolt of Labour against the slum landlords, grabbers and sweating employers who control that movement is a very naughty, unpatriotic, anti-Irish, irreligious, blasphemous, immoral, factionless, traitorous, cloven-hoofed sort of iniquity that ought to be suppressed. And it has enabled the Orange leaders to openly flout and antagonise the Labour movement here in Belfast. And he's writing this from Belfast. Okay? And it's in this position that we then understand that if you take Home Rule out and you put Sinn Féin in after 1917, Connolly would have had the same analysis, despite the fact that he makes common cause with Republicans during 1916. So we will see that before his death in 1916, Connolly has in many respects prophesied the nature of the Sinn Féin revolution. He also prophesies what will result from partition. Okay, partition is accepted by both unionists and nationalists, they just can't accept the details, it's a bit like Brexit. Okay? In March 1914, on what's called county option, where John Redmond essentially yields to the unionist campaign against Home Rule, and he accepts that counties in Ulster will be excluded on the basis of the majority in that county. Writing from his home on the Falls Road, just opposite the city cemetery, Connolly predicts that partition will usher in a carnival of reaction north and south, because it will divide the Labour movement, okay, and it will strengthen orange capitalism in the north and green capitalism in the south. Okay, and by the end of this talk, hopefully you will see that Connolly should have went to the bookies. Very good at predicting who was going to be the winners. Okay, so Lord and Connolly and Syndicalism. Syndicalism was a form of extreme socialism imported from the continent and from America. Its origins are in France. It promoted the idea of one big union and the general strike to overthrow capitalism. It led to great industrial unrest in Britain with violence in Glasgow, Liverpool and Clonopandi. Larkin and Connolly added it to their separatist nationalism. They welded the syndicalism to a very, very strident form of Irish republicanism. Okay, this antagonises some of colleagues in Belfast, particularly William Walker, but it leads to Connolly being able to convert a considerable amount of the labour movement in Belfast, Protestant trade unionists, to separatism. And we'll see this later on. They're not successful, or as successful, in converting the general Protestant working class. Okay? The Irish Transport and General Workers Union then is created as a syndicalist union, or a one big union, on the wobbly model. The wobbly model being the International Workers of the Board in America. It's good to be somewhere you can say things like word and word, when people understand you. Belfast have to say word. So anybody who wants to get in, I don't want to spend an hour talking about syndicalism, although I probably will. Anybody who's interested in this here should read Emmett O'Connor's book Syndicalism in Ireland. Okay, and O'Connor book really hasn't been surpassed, and it's unique in its field because of its scope. It's just a really excellent book. But what O'Connor identifies is how syndicalism was a very neat fit for the nature of the Irish working class. How it chained with many of the beliefs that they had anyway, and how it was perhaps the best way to try and organise as diverse and as scattered a working class. That the tools of working class militancy and industrial unionism that were employed in other countries, particularly labour reformism in Britain and things like that weren't suitable to Ireland because of the precarious nature of the working class. But that syndicalism was a very neat fit, both in economic and in political and historical terms. He says that by sanctifying solidarity, syndicalism harnessed the powerful conformism in Irish society to turn an employment structure that normally would cripple collective action. Because in Ireland, if you said, I want more wages, your employer said, go to America, because there's a line outside and I get a way to do your job for less money. There was a scarcity of employment. Wages were lower than anywhere else. People were leaving the country in their droves. But if all of the working class organised themselves, and an injury to one was concerned everybody, then this is actually a weakness being employed as a strength. It was not just a matter of tactics, but of morals. And if both men were incredibly moralistic in the way that they preached. Their achievement in overcoming the inherent obstacles to organisation in agriculture spurred them on to become Labour's largest and most militant sector, the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. They, more than any other group, embodied the spirit and style of syndicalism. So you have a grouping in society who are just about to die out, who have been partially consumed into the farmer class by land legislation and are being allowed to wither on the vine and board the emigration ships because of the move from pastoralism to pastoralism, the Irish agricultural labour. And the revolutionary period is their last big kick. And they employ syndicalism in the Irish Transport and General Workers Union to try and maintain some sort of presence in Ireland, and they fail, but they fail spectacularly. And very, very quickly the numbers go from over 200,000 to 100,000. And this is economic necessity. This is what it's called. But it's called a country where there's no room for poor people. But it wasn't that the whole point of the one big union. What is the point? That an injury to one was a concern of all. That you didn't join because you were strong, but to be strong. If you could not call on other sections for help, then why have one big union? And this is O'Connor's criticism of the inheritors of the labour movement, Thomas Johnson and William O'Brien later on. So, where does this syndicalism find its expression? It finds it in Dublin. Here's Larkin, the haunt in Dublin. This is obviously anti-Larkin propaganda, but Larkin went to Dublin after the 1907 Belfast strike. He led a successful Dublin dock strike in 1908. He formed the Irish Transport General Workers Union in December 1908 as well. Dublin employers, led by William Martin Murphy, locked out the workers in an attempt to break Larkin's union, and they employed the full force of Hibernian scab labour from Belfast, sent down by Joe Devlin, and the Roman Catholic Church, where a priest told their congregation that Larkin always wore a hat because he had a third eye. Okay? That he was the devil incarnate. Okay, after 8 months, the strike fails. Okay, and the union becomes demoralised. But it is the greatest piece of industrial militancy in Irish history, and it establishes trade unionism in Ireland, because even though the strike fails, the Dublin employers will not execute the coup de grace because of the costs, despite the fact that William Martin Murphy is in tandem. William Martin Murphy is the owner of the Irish Independent, so their political view hasn't changed much in the preceding 100 years. He's also a former MP, and he's essentially the paymaster of an individual Irish Parliament, an adjunct of the Irish Parliamentary Party or opposition party called the All Firm League. He's an Irish nationalist. Okay? He's an Irish nationalist who refuses trade union recognition in a country with the fifth largest, or a city with the fifth largest infant mortality rate in the world, where over half of the people live in one-room accommodations with more than 4 people in them. Okay? This is Dublin in 1913. Larkin left for America after the lockout, leaving Connolly in charge of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And this is the Irish Trade Union Congress in 1914. Now, Thomas Johnson wasn't there that day, we don't know why. But G.R. Wilson, or Campbell of Belfast, this is P.T. Daly, this is Connolly, who, like all great men, was very short in stature. And this is William O'Brien, and here's Big Jim. Okay? Now, the Irish Trade Union Congress is particularly important. It's important because it's very ineffective during the revolutionary period. Rather than instigating activity amongst the unions, it typically responds and restrains calls for significant social change. And this is one of these great what-ifs, had Larkin not been arrested and sent to Sing Sing in New York, or had Connolly not been executed after 1916, had people of a revolutionary syndicalist perspective been in control of the labour movement, we might suggest that a far more formidable challenge would have been presented by the leadership of labour. Ordinary members of the trade unions present a significant challenge both north and south. The leadership are quietist in their strategy. Connolly, this is not a talk about 1916, I think some of us have been to some of my talks in 1916. But why does Connolly get involved in 1916? If you want to break it down, think about what he says himself about it. He's a member of the Second International. He's completely disenchanted by the fact that the working classes across Europe, rather than building barricades, actually go and follow nationalism, go to the German, the French and the British Army. And he says, starting thus, 1916, Ireland may yet set the torch to a European conflagration that will not only burn out until the last throne and last capitalist bond and debenture will be shrivelled on the funeral pyre of the last warlord. Okay? And in many respects, 1916 adds to a general collapse in the European political and social order, particularly from 1917 onwards. And we have to really understand that the TINA, that there is no alternative line that people were swallowing for a generation, explodes in the conditions of the First World War. Okay, where over 15 million people die, most of them poor people, and where people come back from their experience in the war and say things have to change. And this fuels an awful lot of militancy. Not just in Ireland. You have in Britain as well, you have Red Clydeside, you have the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years in northern Italy, you have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, you have the German Revolution, which is suppressed on this date 100 years ago, well, a few days ago when Rosa Luxemburg was kissed. So, nobody noticed, and this is one of the ironies, is that Connolly kind of bought Labour a place in the Nationalist Revolution. But the leadership of the Labour Party abstained from the Nationalist Revolution. And they left the field to petty bourgeois nationalists and to some Irish capitalists. And the seeds of the Irish counter-revolution are planted in the creation of Sinn Féin in October 1917. And Padre O'Donnell, who was a member of the Irish Transport and General Worker Union and a follower of Connolly, was at the Mansion House conference, and he said nobody noticed that Connolly's chair was left vacant, that the place Connolly purchased for the organised labour movement in the independence struggle was being denied or refused. Okay? Now, this is Liberty Hall, James Connolly murdered 12th May 1916. In fact, when the Irish Trade Union Congress meets after 1916, they pass condolences for both the British soldiers who died, their former members in the British Army, and Connolly at the same time. So I'm trying to ride 2 horses at once. It's only when they realise how popular mood is changing that they adopt an incredibly radical tone later on. Okay, So when does this the social tumult start? When does it begin? It really begins in 1917. It precedes the political revolution. Okay? Because of the way that the Labour movement or the Labour leadership deal with the national revolution, Sinn Féin, and the fact that they called 4 general strikes all on nationalist issues in the period instead of concentrating on social issues, should not hide the fact that, in fact, social revolution or attempts at significant social change predate the political revolution by almost 2 years. Alright, this is a famous banknote created by the Limerick Soviet later on. So the wages struggle in 1917. Alright, between June, why does the wages struggle take place? It takes place for one really good reason. Alright? Irish farmers and Irish industrialists make an absolute killing out of the war. But they don't pay their workers in line with their profits. Alright? Ireland has a rate of enlistment in proportional terms a quarter of enlistment in England, Scotland and Wales. Okay? It's not out of any sort of nationalist sentiment, it's because there was too much money to be made on farms in Ireland. Okay? These are the deposits in Irish banks, and this is the difference between June 1914 and December 1917. There were £61 million deposited in banks in 1914, there were 91 million in December 1917. Big Irish farmers were doing very well out of high agricultural prices and the fact that their main competitors weren't able to grow anything because the land was all taken up with trenches. This is the agricultural price index. In 1914 it was 101 points, by 1920 it's 288 points. The demand for wages emerged from working class people who noticed that their employers were doing very well, but they weren't giving them proper recompense. And this is how trade union consciousness starts to develop. Now, it develops unevenly because it takes off really in the north, as you would expect, because it's more industrial, than it does in the south, and there's something of a time lag. Okay? But it happens in East Tyrone, and again, this is a good anecdote to try and. I'll let this try and guess who the employer is here. The welfare one. So, between July and November 1917, the Workers' Union, or it's actually the National Union Government Workers under Dawson Gordon, a man from Belfast, a committed Protestant trade unionist from Connolly, organised the workers at the Rowan's spinning mill in Connolly. Okay, the workers should be paid, this is Gordon speaking, recognised wage, same rate as the Flax and Spinners Association for the district. By July 1918, the Rowan's spinning mill, they are now arguing not for a rise in wages but for a closed shop. You're not going to work here unless you're a member of our union. So it goes from increased wages to union recognition and then unionised labour. So within a year their demand has already increased. July 1918 in the Rowan's spinning mill, they said where 3 non-union workers were taken on and the other workers went on strike, with the result that the non-union workers joined the union. Okay, and it's in this period between 1917 and 1920, when the economy is booming, that you get the high water mark of industrial militancy or trade union militancy in Ireland. This spreads from Connolly to Dungannon. And Dawson Gordon, now if anybody wants to know what Dawson Gordon's politics are, Dawson Gordon is elected as Belfast Labour Party councillor in the famous January 1920 election. And if you want to see what his position on the national question on social revolution is, read an excellent book written by a female American journalist in 1920 called What's the Matter with Ireland? And it's free online. It's brilliant. But Gordon then has meetings in Dungannon where both Catholic and Protestant workers strike for better wages. He says that Dungannon workers could fight as well as those in Connolly, who had now been fighting for 5 months and were going to continue fighting until they would get what they were out for. And it was believed from the support they were getting all over the country that they would get their demands. Which I think is at the top of Milltown, Dungannon. There's a meeting of both Catholics and Protestant workers. Dawson Gordon is the union organiser again, and he says, they were witnessing a period in history of some people when nothing else could be done except try their strength for the other side, and the strongest side won. As far as Connolly was concerned, the society was the strongest side, the Union. Gordon believed that the dispute had done a great deal of good because the employers in Dungannon and Cookstown would realise that the society was fairly strong and had been able to fight a strong battle, or to fight a strong battle, and at the end win. Okay? So, we have a collection of Catholic and Protestant mill workers in Dungannon, and the mills are owned by leading Unionist politicians, Dixon and Stevenson, and they're being organised by a Connollyite socialist from Belfast. Right? Now, this doesn't go unnoticed by the employers. Okay? Now, the most radical strike in the area happens at the Colleen Soapworks in Donoughmore, that stronghold of socialism. Okay? So there's another strike in Colleen Soap Factory. 60 workers come out, and then 140 workers, Catholics and Protestants, come out at Brown Soapwork in Donoughmore. Right? George McClone and Robert Stewart seize the company lorry, drive it through the front gates, and attempt to seize the factory. They have a parade in the town with a big red flag. They march up and down Donoughmore, singing the red flag with a big red banner with "Up the Workers' Union" on it. Okay? Now, Brown, the owner of the soapworks, then began to re-employ people on a sectarian basis. He only let Protestants join the union again, and he sent them out of the union, out of the factory gates with Union Jacks. That went down very well, and there was a wreck. Okay? But this is a pattern that will be followed later on, most notably in Caledon. But what we witness here is, as you can see from these fine gentlemen, okay, these are the very poorest people in the area. These are not property people. Okay? They're ordinary working class people who probably have had to put up with an awful lot and now sense that things are able to change. And rather than tip their hat, and they're all wearing hats, and go, "No, it's Mr. Brown's factory and we take what we're given," they go, "Hold on a minute." And the mood changes. Now, so that's the initial wage period. And what happens in this period, and this happens across Ireland, it starts really in Ulster because Ulster is more industrialised, but it spreads throughout the country very, very quickly. And you get an awful lot of what you would call basic union demands, which breed greater militancy and then lead to greater demands. And you get a process of radicalisation, which is well on the way, even in places like Tyrone, before the national question really takes off. So you have ordinary people mobilising, joining trade unions, demanding better conditions, demanding closed shops. You have hundreds, if not thousands, of people engaged in this here from late 1917 through to 1919 in Tyrone. And there's more people doing this than are involved in nationalist and unionist politics at the time in terms of immediate agency. And Catholic and Protestant people are doing it together. Now, it's the issue of the national question that in part fractures this, and the issue of conscription. But not for the very, very poor Protestants. Because we have evidence, yes, evidence from Tyrone, that former members of the UVF, joined the Irish Volunteer Force in April 1918 in Tyrone. Okay? In Dromore and in Clonabog. Because they didn't really want to go out to the continent either. Because they knew what happened to you on the continent. And for a very, very short period of time, you actually had some crossover. What we can probably say about this is that this happens more at the very bottom of society than it does as you proceed up society. Okay? And this is particularly true in Belfast. Now, this is Thomas Johnson. Thomas Johnson is essentially in charge of the labour movement after Connolly's death. And Johnson is inherently conservative. He's not a syndicalist. In fact, he's an Englishman who gets involved in the Irish trade union movement in Belfast with Connolly and Campbell, and then he's a bureaucrat. And his dream is to have an Irish labour movement just like the English labour movement, which is a fine dream because there's nothing wrong with the British trade union movement. The problem is Ireland is not Britain. It operates under very, very different economic conditions. So what Johnson does, and this is from O'Connor, he comes out with the anomaly of rhetorical extremism and practical quietism, which means he talks the talk, but he doesn't walk the walk. He lauds the Russian Revolution, he talks about revolution. Read The Vice of Labour, which is written by Cathal O'Shannon from Randallstown, who's a member of the ARB and a member of the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And it's like reading something written by the Bolsheviks. And it's just next week we're going to take over Ireland and we're going to set up a socialist republic. They don't call it a socialist republic, they call it a workers' republic. Alright? Or a cooperative commonwealth. These are the two big aspirations and dreams that they have. But what the leadership do to achieve this is nothing. In fact, they use rhetoric as a stalling mechanism, a way to keep the membership happy and to keep things under control. And as Kieran Allen, in another excellent book, 1916 and the Revolutionary Legacy, it only became an abortive revolution because no political force emerged which could fuse national and social demands. The opportunity was there for the Labour Party to engage more fully in the national revolution, and they abstained. They eventually supported Sinn Féin's demand, but they let Sinn Féin do whatever they want, and they took no part in it. So when the British come to a settlement with the leaders of the national revolution, they don't come to a settlement with the leaders of organised labour. They come to a settlement with the most conservative elements of the Sinn Féin consensus. And all the rhetorical extremism of someone like Johnson evaporates in thin air with the consolidation of the Free State. But it doesn't evaporate in thin air, it evaporates under an iron fist. So the refusal to engage politically with the Republic effectively confined the revolutionary spirit to the industrial arena. So you have this incredible image of Ireland, conservative, nice, stoic, Protestant, Presbyterian Ireland in the north, and good Catholic, pious Ireland in the south, and you have this idea where the country is raged by industrial militancy. In hundreds of sites across Ireland, ordinary people are organising themselves in their demand for significant social change under the label of the Workers' Republic and the Cooperative Commonwealth. Okay? And it's combined to the industrial arena. It has no political expression because their political representatives don't want involvement. They play it safe. And this has very, very serious repercussions for those of a radical bent who would like a social revolution. I suggest there may be some people here who wouldn't. From 1918 to 1922, Congress called 4 general strikes, and they were all successful. In fact, it's the Labour General Strike which defeats conscription, and it's the Labour General Strike which gets the release of Sinn Féin and Labour political prisoners or hunger strike. They reduce the country outside Belfast to a standstill. But they don't do it for their own agenda. They do it at the behest or on the behalf of Sinn Féin. Okay? They acted as a substitute for revolutionary initiative. Okay? These general strikes, rather than coming out in a general strike and saying, see this revolution we're having, by the way, this is what we want out of it. This is limited to the democratic programme. Now, what's the best example of this? The best example of this is Johnson's decision not to contest the 1918 general election. Right? Now, Johnson says that he's very selfless and the Labour movement's really selfless, and this is allowing Sinn Féin to get a mandate for self-determination. Okay? The reality really is that this produces an awful lot of animosity, and it's a missed opportunity. Because the reaction in Belfast Labour to the decision not to contest the election, they claimed that they were bowing down to Sinn Féin. So you have hundreds of very committed Connollyite socialists in the Belfast trade union movement who look at Thomas Johnson's decision and go, why are you leaving the field open to bourgeois nationalists, to green nationalism? Okay? Why are you allowing green nationalism, and why is Labour taking a side step back and bowing down to Sinn Féin? And when you think back to what Connolly said about what's the difference between a green capitalist and an orange capitalist. So they organised the Belfast Labour Party. It's founded in 1917 and contested the 1918 election in the 4 Belfast seats. They acquire a fifth of the vote. Even though the Nationalists stand, even though Sinn Féin stand, and even though both Unionists and Unionist Labour stand. Now, Unionist Labour Association members are elected in working class constituencies too. And the Ulster Unionist Labour Association is a device employed by Carson and by Dawson Bates to try and deflect support for genuine trade unionism in Belfast. We'll talk about that in a wee bit. So, why does he agree to Labour's extension? Okay, he was worried that if they didn't do well, they would lose momentum. He was also worried that if they did do well, they'd have to abstain from Westminster. Okay? He gets it passed at the executive by 96. The Irish Trade Union Congress is get with 96 votes to 23. But he's opposed by the most Republican members of the Labour Party, Thomas Farren and Cahal O'Shannon, who say we need to be represented in this. Now, the recompense for this, the payoff for this, is that Johnson and Cahal O'Shannon get to write the democratic programme for the first Dáil. Okay? So this is Eamon, De Valera. So, the day that the first Dáil opens, now there's only 19 added, I think, because the rest of them are all in jail. They read the Declaration of Independence, okay, and then they read the democratic programme. Right? Sinn Féin obviously won 72 out of 105 seats. 21st of January 1919, and Kate Dáil, the first Dáil. The democratic programme promotes public ownership of the means of production, public control of all the natural resources and wealth, state provision of education for children and care for the elderly, ensuring that children receive food. Private property was to be, and this is very, very key, private property was to be subordinate to the public right and welfare. So, O'Shannon's interviewed about this later on. He says that he based it on Pearse's, not on Connolly, on Pearse's writing at the end of his life, A Sovereign People. And that Harry Boland and Sean Taylor Kelly got it and cut sort of the worst communist excesses out of it, and they passed it. But the Dáil stood on the democratic programme, and it was mandated in January and June 1820 in the local government elections. Okay? And if you read the democratic programme, it's an incredibly socialistic document. But it's just that. It's a piece of paper. Right? Now, it's in this period when Labour's kind of engaged and sitting on their hands, they write the democratic programme, they go to the meeting of the Second International in Bern, which is the Social Democratic International, which is very quickly usurped by many respects by Lenin's Third International, or Comintern. But O'Shannon goes to Bern and they get recognition of the Republic at the International Socialist Convention in Bern, which is quite a boon. They also vote in favour of a dictatorship of the proletariat. This is the statistic that I already told you about. This is trade union membership in 1916. By 1922, we have almost 250,000 people are members of trade unions, and these trade unions are, at least verbally, in favour of a cooperative Commonwealth and a workers' republic. Right? By April 1920, there's a general strike for the release of political prisoners. The general strike is organised by the trades councils, which have popped up all over Ireland. There's a really, really strong trades council in Omagh, under James Feargal, a local Labour councillor. Okay? There's some very good anecdotes about that and funny stories. But you can ask me questions and I tell you they're wrong because I'm conscious that we're running out of time. But these trades councils designate themselves as Soviets, and then it's in this period that you get factory seizures. Okay, this is very, very famous, and it's the site on the cover of Abbott O'Connor's book. This is the Soviet mills. Okay, and I think this one's from Limerick or Waterford, and it says we make bread, not profit. So, and O'Connor describes this period, this from 1918 through to 1921, through until the truce, up until the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and he says, Red Banners, May Day rallies, workers' Ariachti, which are outdoor social events, Soviets and the Mosquito Press are merely the archival remains of a spirit that once electrified vast sections of the labour movement, under the demand of a workers' republic and a cooperative Commonwealth. There were 80 Soviets, 80 factory occupations in the 26 counties in 1922, particularly in Red Munster. Now they were able to do that because there was no law and order. There was no recognised state. And this is the point that I've made previously. When the opportunity was there for significant social change, when people thought that they had agency and they could make a difference, ordinary people got active. Okay? They moved from a very traditional defeatism, where if you can't change it, you can't change things. Things will never change. We'll always be down here and they'll always be up there. And they seized the opportunity. And they failed. But this history has been essentially erased from the records of these years. Because people who occupy positions of influence and are quite wealthy probably don't want us to know, particularly those of us who aren't particularly financially well off, that our grandparents and great-grandparents didn't accept it either and tried to change it. This is Gallo Shannon hunger strike, revolution. So what does Sinn Féin promote? The Sinn Féin promotes the democratic programme, but it doesn't promote the democratic programme. Okay? Sinn Féin employ an Ulster Protestant, William Ford Patterson, to investigate how they can convert Ulster Protestant working class to Sinn Féin. And Patterson writes a lengthy report and he says, you have to promote the concepts of the democratic programme, and you have to try and suggest that Sinn Féin is a party that's intent on the elevation of the lower and working classes. Sinn Féin didn't do it. Because the people who were in control of Sinn Féin, not just David Earl is ambiguous on the social question, but people like Arthur Griffith opposed the 1913 lockout. People like Arthur Griffith are opponents of trade unionism. Okay?
Sorry, the lockout or the strike?
No, he opposed the strike.
Yeah.
He supported William Martin Murphy. Okay? So Griffith sides with the employers during 1913. Right? People like Kevin O'Higgins, Liam Cosgrave, do not want to promote the democratic programme. The democratic programme is a sop to Labour. And it's under these circumstances that O'Higgins calls it a fairy story. A convenient thing to present to Labour to get them on board and to gain their support, but we're not really serious about it. Now, why would this have worked? Or partially worked? It would have partially worked because Dawson Gordon, who was the Irish Textile Federation organiser and a Connolly socialist from Belfast, his membership in his union grew from 400 in 1914 to 40,000 in 1919. And these were all unorganised, unskilled millies and people who worked in mills. And he organised Catholics and Protestants. And these are the people, when they got the vote, who came out and voted for Dawson Gordon in Belfast in January 1920. And they weren't just Catholics. Now, there's very clear evidence, obviously, that the skilled Protestant working class never had any sort of affinity with Dawson Gordon or with the Belfast Labour Party. But in this period, between 1918 and 1920, there's a clear indication that these men are making inroads in Belfast in terms of attracting support amongst Catholics and Protestants. Sinn Féin have no real interest in this. James McGillian, the Urban District Councillor and the head of Oma's Trade Council, before the election, 1918 general election, claimed that no party of any shape or form had ever come to their assistance, so that they had to organise themselves under the banner of trade unionism. The working man was hardly known except on the day of the poll, and on the next day they were not known at all. And this is a man who supported the Republic, or self-determination. Father O'Donnell later said that we lost out in 1921 during the treaty debates and the consolidation of the Free State because there was no day-to-day struggle within the Sinn Féin movement for differentiation between a working class social revolution and a political revolution. So that in those days we were forced to defend ranches when agricultural labourers seized the ranches and tried to operate them for their own behalf and divide them up, enforce rents for landlords, and be neutral in strikes. In fact, you have the scene of lower class IRA men being sent out to the Dáil by a man from Oma called Kevin O'Sheil to break up strikes on behalf of the employers, many of whom are unionists. The Free State, he said, was in existence long before the name was adopted. Okay? The seeds of the Free State were there at the foundation of Sinn Féin. So Belfast, 1918 to 1920. And this is the Lord Mayor of Belfast driving through the strikers. Well, you can't see him behind. Now, this is actually Red Clydeside, okay, which was a contemporary event just before the Belfast engineer strike. Okay, in 1918, the honest, the miraculous year of prosperity, employment in linen reached 90,000. And in Belfast, 30,000 people were employed in shipbuilding. Okay, so trade unionism was in a strong position. In January 1919, there was a general strike in Belfast amongst 20,000 shipyard engineering workers. Okay, 40,000 workers not come out, 20,000 are laid off. Now, this is not the same as Red Clydeside, and this is why. Because trade unionism in Belfast is split between skilled trade unionism, okay, the craft unions, the engineers and the shipbuilders, okay, who want to protect their position. A skilled tradesman in Belfast typically made between 3 and 4 times more than an unskilled worker. James Connolly called this an aristocracy of labour. Okay? The shipyard workers are the shock troops of the employers and the unionist politicians breaking up of the trade union movement in Belfast.